Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome. I'm Rosa Lizardi, the Global Director of the Feminist Task Force and one of the co-conveners of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. Welcome to today's webinar, What the Social Contract Means in the Age of Data, Feminist Visions and Perspectives. This webinar is part of a series called Macro Solutions for Women, the People and the Planet, which we are presenting to delve into the systemic dynamics underpinning women's inequality, the feminization of poverty in the time of COVID, and the systemic issues undermining the well-being of women, their families, their communities, people, and our planet. We began this series covering the financial impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic back in May. And today is our 9th webinar and our last in-depth look at a specific issue in the series. Through these webinars, we are taking a deeper dive into the gendered impacts of these issues. And feminist activists and experts have painted a fuller picture and analysis with regard to gender and tax, trade, debt, intellectual property rights, financialization, the climate emergency and the Green New Deal, and the care economy. Today, we focus on digitalization and what the social contract means in the age of data. And at the very end of our program, my colleague Emilia Reyes of Equidad de Género, who is the other co-convener of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development, will inform us on what are the next steps and what will we be doing post this webinar series, Macro Solutions for Women, People, and the Planet. So without further delay, let me introduce our for today's webinar, Mariama Williams, a wonderful friend and colleague. We are so thrilled to have Mariama as our moderator today. Mariama is the program coordinator of the Sustainable Development, Climate Change, and Gender Program at the South Center in Geneva. She is also a director of the Institute of Law and Economics in Jamaica, and she is the author of a number of books, including Climate Change Finance, Coming Out of the Margins. Her current research areas are debt, the financial crisis, climate change financing, and gender, trade, and development. So we're thrilled. Welcome, Mariama. Thank you for being here and moderating this wonderful session. We welcome you, and I am going to turn it over to you, and we'll see you at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. It's really exciting for me to be part of this and this concluding session of what has been a trilogy, more than a trilogy. I don't even know the word for 9 trilogies of feminists engaging on the critical questions of the day and the time in the current historical conjecture that we are. We have a sterling panel. We're going to look really at the question of social contracts in the context of IT and all of the various drama that's happening to us. All of us currently, collectively, we're in a crisis, and some of us personally and as households and individuals are in various different crises, depending on our attachment to labor force and various other things. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce all of the panelists so you can get to see them, and then we'll go sequentially down the panel, starting with Deborah. We'll give an overview, and then Kate, and then Anita, wrapping up with Dr. Laura Mann, who will be a respondent. And then we'll have some opening discussions and question and answer, and then Emilia will come back in to wrap up the whole series in a nice, neat bow. All right, so I'm going to start first by introducing you to our first speaker, who's going to give us a very global and perspective, including developing countries, interrelationship, and I'll say more about what she's going to talk about when she gets on. Her name is Deborah James. I'm sure she's very familiar to all of you out there. She's the director of the international programs at the Center for Economic Policy and Research in Washington, D.C. She facilitated global civil society network on the World Trade Organization called Our World Is Not for Sale, ONFs, and she regularly advises civil society, trade unions, and governments around the world on the proposed new rules on digital trade in the WTO. Her most recent publication, Digital Trade Rules, a disastrous new constitution for the global economy, written for and by big tech. And we look forward to hearing some of those exposés from that book. She's a successful campaigner with Public Services Trade Union to stop the proposed trade and service agreement, TISA. And Deborah has really been a long-term advocate of fair, just trade, looking at it from the perspective of the bottom up, farmers, women, male farmers, community groups, and various actors in civil society. So we'll look forward to hearing from that. Following Deborah's presentation, we'll have Kate Lapin, who is the Asia Pacific Regional Secretary for the Public Service International, PSI, a very well-known institution to many of us, the Global Federation Union that represents 30 million workers and their union, and they deliver public services in more than 150 countries. And Kate previously headed the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, and has published on the impact of trade agreements on human rights. Following Kate, we'll have Anita Gurumurthy, who is a founding member and executive director and a co-sponsor of this event, IT for Change. IT for Change works on a number of areas, which we'll hear about when I have to introduce her once again. But focusing on research on emerging issues in the digital context, such as the platform economy, data, AI governance, democracy in the digital age, and feminist frameworks on digital justice. After that, we'll have a nice round out with responding by Dr. Laura Mann, Assistant Professor, Department of International Development, London School of Economics and Political Science, who has been a very prolific writer, looking at issue as her latest publication, See Nudge Control and Profit Digital Platform as Privatized Epistemic Infrastructure. So this is going to be a very interesting presentation from her. She's done case studies looking at Rwanda and South Africa, and talked about also looked at the political economy on big data revolution and development. So this should be a very interesting panel. I'm going to come back now to Deborah and ask Deborah to take the floor. I want to just address one or two things. The pendulum, or the container in which discussion is occurring. Two things are being considered: IT, but also social contracts. And social contract has been around for a while, right? Since the 17th century Enlightenment period. And it refers to, and I'm going to draw on some discussions by Sen and Dita Sen and Marina Durano in the remaking of social contracts, Feminists in the Fierce New World, that they've had some of the most recent discussions I've seen around social contract, looking at feminist perspective. And they talk about it in terms of social processes, transformation, and the political economy of power, which we will unpack with each of these speakers. We all know that a social contract is a collective agreement, right? It's built in and it's imbued with power. It can be imposed from above, or we have to fight from it from below. And it holds the potential for change. It can be fluid, stable, it can hold the potential for cohesive. Here we're talking about global social contract that links to national and regional experiences and elaboration of that. So our collective understanding of what we think social contracts are really being put to the test now in this time of COVID, where the inequality that's previously existed, and for many of the poorest people at the bottom of the pyramid, they never fully recovered from the financial crisis, though we know the top 1% has. And we see now with the COVID crisis that the tech companies are reaping a gigantic profit, and at the same time they're the least taxed. And so there's a big discussion at the OECD right now about the rights to tax digital economy that's going on, which we also need to plug in, and we need to support the developing countries who are carrying that weight to try to get that right and make sure that that right exists, even if there's no new agreement, but the rights they now have to be able to begin to tax some of the profits from these tech giants. So these are all part of social contracts. They're imbued with internal contradiction and power dynamics. And so we'll hear about a lot of that, in particular from the different speakers, about how they're seeing a social contract and what are the progressive ways that we can remake the present social contract, and how social movements and the changing technology and all the various instabilities that are around can help us towards an open-ended, meaningful social justice, human rights-based social contract, since the post-war period and now under this COVID. The COVID definitely has put us in a frame of reference with all the stuff that's going around: Black Lives Matter, inequality showing up, bringing to the fore the role of essential workers, dominated again by women across the globe, and the various inequalities that this has imbued and the kind of suffering that we see. So this collective crisis and the collective drama that we're all involved with, we're pulling at it from many different ways. And the two groups that have pulled this together, really, the Feminist Task Force and Policies and Budget for Equality and Sustainable Development, Gender Equity, Citizens from Work, by Emilia Reyes, and of course Anita and ITC are really pushing us to the fore to think more and to begin to forward this discussion on social contracts. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Deborah on, and Deborah is going to talk a little bit about the big tech, right? In the context of digital trade, and how a handful of companies control this digital value chain, and what does that mean for all of us, and how does it impact us, and how can we as civil society in our various different ways organize to rebuild or build a new social contract within this context. So Deborah, thank you. Thank you for coming to speak. Looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you to these wonderful organizations for organizing such an exciting series and panel today. So I do have a presentation. If you could bring up the slideshow, that would be great. And I'm going to go through the slides very quickly. We will make it available to you to view afterwards. So I'm not sure if they are available. There you go. So next slide, please. This is just the intro there. So first, when we're talking about technology, and I'm going to focus on the issue of digital trade and the rules that are currently being proposed under digital trade agreements. So when we talk about technology, and especially with regards to social contract, the first issue really is, what is it good for? We want to talk about, is technology there for us to become subservient to it, for us to become data production automatons in the service of private capital? Or should technology be harnessed to solve climate change, to improve our lives, to create jobs, to reduce inequality? And what I want to share is that the way that technology will be used, if it's going to be, to achieve the good things in life that we need as humans, or to be in the service of private capital, will depend on the rules that are set in its development. And those rules will depend on who is actually in the seat of the rule making. Next slide, please. So there are really, it's very urgent that we have new rules on technology. So just a couple ones that are obvious. We need new rules on antitrust to break up monopolies. We need new rules on tax to make sure they pay their fair share. We need new labor rules. I mean, we can all see there's a lot of new rules that need to happen. Next slide, please. But what big tech is doing right now is they want to consolidate their business model by gaining new rules through a trade agreement. So 5 of the 6 largest corporations in the history of the world are all US-based big tech corporations, and I think you know their names. And so what they want to do is actually use trade agreements which are far less democratic than other sorts of channels, to bind the international economy in the future to basically distribute income upwards to themselves. And the 2 types of rules they're looking at would really be rights to trade, and those rights are exercised by corporations, okay? And the other type of rules they have are restrictions on regulating trade, and those restrictions apply to governments. So it's one of those 2 options. Next slide, please. So we know that actually digital chapters already exist in a lot of trade agreements. So there was the Trade and Services Agreement that was derailed actually by Our World Is Not for Sale Network, working with Public Services International trade unions from around the world. But digital trade provisions are already incorporated, unfortunately, into a number of trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the USMCA. So if your country is one of any of these that are members of these agreements, the RCEP right now that's not implemented, you will already be bound to it. And they are going to be in every trade agreement with any developed country that you see from now on. Next slide, please. But also there is an effort started by the United States, unfortunately under the Obama administration, when they hired a corporate lobbyist to develop a new set of trade rules for the United States to propose. And we have done that. I'm from the US. We have been shopping that around the world and are now trying to get all countries that are members of the WTO to agree to a new round of negotiations within the WTO that would bind all 164 members. Now, developing countries made a heroic effort in 2017, led by the Africa Group, India, several other countries, and they actually stopped this. They said, no, we're not going to do this 2017. But since then, more than 80 countries, including a lot of developing countries, have been participating in these negotiations in the WTO. Next slide, please. Now, I have to make clear at the beginning that we're not talking about e-commerce, because some people say, oh, they have e-commerce negotiations. No, this is not just about buying and selling things online, shopping from eBay. This is really about locking in their business model. What do I mean by that? Well, if we look at their business model, okay, what is it? They want access to an infinite supply of cheap labor stripped of their rights. So if you look at a corporation like Uber, their entire business model is designed to pay taxi drivers less than they were earning in the market before. This is the entire business model by pretending that they're contractors instead of employees, okay? Most of these businesses operate outside the law. It's one of the reasons why Airbnb is cheaper than hotels, because they don't have to abide by the regulations, such as making hotel rooms accessible for people with disabilities. They operate by evading taxes. So Amazon is really famous for this, for not paying any taxes. That's how they became big, is that they did not have to charge taxes on the sale of books, while bookstores did. That gave them an unfair competitive advantage, and they became colossal. They also want to be free of legal responsibilities wherever they operate. So if, their platform is used to foment violence against Rohingya Muslims, they say, not our fault. They can't be held responsible. They also want rights to access markets. So they don't just want to be in your country. They want the right to be there so that the government can't prevent them from offering whatever goods and services they want. And the most important, perhaps, is that they want control of the data, and that we will get to that, of consumers, of workers, of everything. Next slide, please. So just really quickly, when you say, well, okay, so this sounds bad, but what are the rules that they're proposing? I don't have time to go through all of them, so we're just going to focus on a couple. This highlighted one here, giving foreign transnational corporations more rights to collect and transfer data out of the country without local access. Okay, so I'm going to explain that one. The next slide also lists so those are the rights. The previous slide was the rights that the digital trade rules would give big tech. There's also, we said, the restrictions on government. So there's a whole series of restrictions on governments that the proposed rules would ban governments from doing a lot of regulatory activities in the public interest. A couple of them are really important when we look at the social contract and impacts on women. One of them is taxing digital trade. So it would ban governments from taxing digital trade. It would also ban governments from being able to require disclosure of source code and algorithms. I'll explain that. And it would also ban governments from being able to hold intermediary service providers, that's the platforms, liable for harms caused on their platforms. Next slide, please. So let's look at each of these issues, okay? So, we have to take a step back at first and say the goal of these proposed rules is to give big tech corporations more power and profit in the world. That's why their lawyers wrote them. That's why the U.S. Trade Representative is taking them on. So if we look at as workers, as women workers, if we give these rules, if we allow our governments to accept these rules as binding, there will be a huge transfer of political power from governments, from people, from workers to the corporations. That's the goal of them. That's why they are proposing them. But if we look at a specific rule, the biggest goal they have within the rules is to gain the right so that the harvester or the collector of the data actually owns the data and can transfer it wherever they want, okay? So the consumer of the data doesn't have any rights to it. The country from which it comes from doesn't have any rights. That really strips developing countries of the biggest, most important economic asset that they currently have, which is data. And it strips it from workers and it strips it from consumers. Okay, so this would have a really big impact on women workers, MSMEs, and caregivers. And it really speaks to the issue of, does the social contract include the obligation of the government to ensure economic prosperity? Okay, next slide, please. I'm trying to run through these quick as possible. There are 7 proposals in the provisions under digital trade that would prevent governments from taxing digital trade, okay? How can you fund a state when you don't tax the biggest, most profitable corporations in the history of the world, okay? So what does that mean? That obviously this would disadvantage women greatly, because it means that when you have a social contract of making sure that the government is providing adequately for caregiving, for hospitals, for healthcare, for education, etc., that burden shifts to women because women have to take up much more of those burdens, and because women as workers are also going to be paying more for the services that still do exist. Next slide, please. There's also a little known provision that would ban the ability of governments to require the disclosure of source code and algorithms. And I want to make a specific pitch to say that this is especially discriminatory towards people of color, towards all marginalized groups, and especially towards women, okay? Because women and people of color and marginalized groups are being especially discriminated against by these algorithms. And so if we can't require that source code, those algorithms to be disclosed, that takes away a tool from our toolbox in holding them accountable, okay? Next slide, please. There's also a final provision I'll just mention, which is that these corporations want to make sure that they can operate in your countries, make money, and have no legal liability for anything that happens on their platform, which is their entire business model, okay? This is called in the United States Section 230. It's a law we have in our Communications Act from a long time ago. We want to export it globally. What does it mean, okay? It means that you can have, we have bans, for example, on sex trafficking in newspapers. You cannot advertise sexually trafficked women in newspapers, but you can online, okay? If you say, well, I didn't know, well, you know, oh, it wasn't me who did it, it was a third party who posted that ad. That is actually the case right now, that there is a huge expansion in online sex trafficking because it is allowed online, even though it's not allowed in traditional advertising media, okay? This is getting worse with deep fakes, where people are actually putting, because of artificial intelligence, women's faces onto nude pornographic images and circulating them online. And if you have Section 230, if you have immunity for the platforms, we have no recourse to do anything about that, okay? There's a whole lot more to explore there, but that just gives you a snapshot in just a few minutes of what some of the nasty implications would be. And by closing, I just want to mention 2 important things. There are alternatives. Next slide, please. Data as a public good. I think that some other speakers are going to talk about this, so I'll just mention that we can have data as a public good. It can be used to strengthen the social contract, to improve services for all citizens, and this is what we should be focusing on, not on corporatizing, privatizing data forever to give it to corporations and allow them to do with it what they please. Next slide, please. The other solution, alternative, is digital industrial development. So governments actually using the data of their country to foment jobs, to create more opportunities for workers, to create more opportunities for small, innovative entrepreneurs, instead of saying, well, we're just going to give this all to the biggest corporations in the history of the world and we get nothing in return. So last, we have to talk about, next slide, please, opportunities for strategic intervention. What can we do? The most important thing, if you are part of these negotiations, ask your government to get the heck out. Why would you be participating in something that's so antithetical to development and sovereignty? But if you are part of it, you know, get out. If you're not part of it, strengthen that resolve of your government not to join the talks. This is a big issue in the WTO. It's going to be a big issue at the upcoming UNCTAD 15. Last slide. Working together, we can make technology serve humanity instead of corporate profit. We don't have to allow these rules to happen. They are not set in stone. They are trying to get in there and set them before everybody realizes the value of data and the importance of maintaining democracy and sovereignty in our countries, and how the usurpation of control of data by corporations will drastically undermine that in a binding agreement forever. So let's join together and make this stop. And my final slide just has a link to a large paper I've just published on this topic, which can be found on the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation website. Please feel free to get in touch with me for more information. Thank you, and I apologize, I think, for going over my time. Thanks so much.
The Herculean task of laying out the global landscape, and in particular the trade risk that are there for undermining women's lives and the lives of men, women, and children, including issues of sex trafficking, including issues of employment, and including issues of how development proceed in an area where digital economy and digitalization is at the forefront of quote-unquote productive activity or production and trade. So thank you very much. You've raised some very provocative questions. Audience, we're not going to take questions per speaker, so please write your question down. We'll have a nice big discussion at the end. So thank you very much. And I know that we'll have some really good discussions because I saw some of the participants, such as Butch Montez, who worked on some of these issues. I wanted to flag just one issue in relation to what Deborah is talking about, that we need to be very vigilant with our governments who are at the WTO. But I also want to flag again one thing I said, which is what's going on at the OECD, that I don't think many people are paying attention to, that the OECD is involved now in a process called the Inclusive Framework, and has proposed a two-pillars approach. And this is rewriting tax law, international tax law, since the 1920s. And it's all about shifting and how you distribute the right to tax for digital company, and the whole area of what do you do with that. So it's a very important discussion. It's coming up again later this year. There's been lots of discussion about it, and if you're interested in some of the papers on it, please consult the South Center website. We've been following that, and that really complements a lot with the WTO. We know that our proponents tend to do forum shopping, which is that they forum shop. If they get an agreement someplace else in a global economy, they then bring it in, and then they say, oh, you've agreed to that there, so why are you not agreeing to that here? So we have to really keep our eye on all the various spaces where this discussion of tax and the digital economy, and the big tech companies are working very hard to make sure that these rules are in their favor. Thank you very much. Now we're going to switch, and we're going to focus a little bit deep dive. Deborah laid the broad landscape. Now we want to go a little bit vertically, and we're going to go to Kate. And Kate is going to share with us the risk for public services in this age of data, and how the digital company can impact public service in a deleterious manner, and that public service is a great equalizer, and tax evasion by all of our industry, but in particular, the ones who are reaping the massive profits right now, robs locality governments of tax revenue to provide the health care that's been rapidly eroded due to the lack of preparedness, and in some cases, lack of care for citizens in many countries. So democracy is at stake, and public service is critical for that. Trade union movements and all are very much involved. PSI is very much involved in fighting and making sure that big tech does not erode labor rights, which Deborah also flagged. And also the big emphasis on public-private partnership, which is the detrimental, which it can be, and is in many cases detrimental to some of the very issues we're talking about, women's right, labor right, and so forth. So Kate, please. Okay, we don't hear you, Kate. You need to put your microphone on, or someone needs to put her microphone on.
No, I think that's me.
Okay. Yes.
Right, thank you. Now I'm just going to try and share my screen. Can you see that now? I think so. Thanks for the introduction there, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this webinar and a very interesting series. I will try and pick up on some of the challenges that Mariama has given us, the broad challenge of renegotiating a social contract in the era of big tech, and particularly from a feminist perspective. And I think, as you mentioned in your introductions, there are so many areas right now for activists to be involved with to try and reshape both the power of big tech, the social contract, and the areas that I really want to focus on primarily, which is public services. And I think I'll just start with the issue of the social contract, because I think it's an important moment in history for us to be thinking about what does the social contract mean, both because of the pandemic that we've been going through, and it's a moment where I think around the world we've looked at the consequences of the erosion of the social contract, the consequences of underfunding, particularly public health, but more broadly public services.
So that's one aspect of the way that the social contract really has been undermined, that governments have largely transferred the idea of risk to the private sector, so that risks are now taken on by individuals, and the government has stepped out of providing that safety net. But also because big tech is largely has effectively changed the nature of governance and what it would mean for a government to provide the social contract. They're changing what it means to have value in the economy, and I think the history of negotiating a social contract has been around the relationship mainly between Labor and state, and now we have a whole new ingredient in the economy that we haven't really factored in, which is the financialization of every part of our lives, the financialization of every interaction we have through this data, digitalized data. So if we look at what we want, I mean, I think as feminists, we are looking at the need for a redistributive social contract, a social contract that would redistribute power between men and women, but presumably also between countries and between the poorest or the least wealthy in our societies, and also of a redistribution of power, a redistribution of wealth, a redistribution of the information that we can all access. And what we know that this type of social contract or this type of redistribution requires good quality, gender responsive public services. Every time we have austerity or other measures to reframe the economy, we know that impacts most negatively on women. So that is a key requirement of a social contract. We also need decent work. We need effective regulation from government. We need an accountable democratic process, but we also need the concept of solidarity. And all of those, I think, are undermined by big tech. And I'll explain a little bit more, but I think Deborah's probably covered a fair bit of that. I'll just focus mainly on public services and decent work. Now, if we think about, I want to make it clear that I'm talking about privatised digital data and the dangers of privatised digital data. So, of course, public services actually can benefit from digital data and from the capacity to aggregate data. But in fact, what we're talking about is privatised digital data. And every part of our interaction, every part of our public services is increasingly depending on digital data, from health, from the delivery of our energy, from the predictions on climate change or how we plan agriculture, how we, in fact, have law enforcement is increasingly encroached by privatised digital data, profiling, for example. Our public records, which have been traditionally, the domain of governments, are now in private hands. Even social protection, our welfare systems are now being transferred to big corporations. And whilst you mentioned tax is a major issue for tax evasion, but also our tax systems are increasingly interacting with privatised data. Health, I think, is one of given the pandemic, is perhaps one of the key areas where we can see the role of big tech. It's a number of big tech companies have projected their own income increasing in big health, and that ranges from sort of devices that will digital diagnostics, health diagnostics. These wearable sensors, for example, that will allow them to collate more health data than any government ever has. And this, I think, is, of course, it's had a lot of publicity around the dangers that has for individuals having their health corporatized or commercialized, or having their health data sold to insurance companies who can make discriminatory decisions but it also undermines public services in that data that we might want as, for public health is no longer in the hands of governments to make public health decisions. If governments want that, they have to purchase it. And of course, companies are collecting data not on the basis of what's good for public health, but what's good for the bottom line, for profits. And wearable sensors is seen as one of the largest growth areas in mainstream. Samsung, for example, sees that as one of their big growth areas. And you'll see this. Here I have this graph which shows that health companies themselves, or not, big tech companies that are engaging in health, see big data analytics as the largest area for their growth. But there's also the other areas of digital growth in health. And largely, one of the significant problems here is that this has largely been done without regulation. So there's a number of digital companies have been recognised that there's obviously a huge growth in here, and there might be a need for some discussions with government, but they're largely writing the rules of digital health regulation themselves, and then approaching government around what they think that should look like. And as you see here, Google Health subsidiary suggesting that there is no need for regulation, or that there needs to be entire deregulation of AI-based healthcare. Other areas of public services are the central government themselves, public administration, or state, local, and federal or national administration is increasingly relying on Amazon or AWS and other large cloud services to hold public data, and other parts of the public sector. So educational institutions, for example, are increasingly using cloud that's commercialized rather than produce their own. What this means, as Deborah mentioned earlier, is that they also would generally not be able to require this data to be held onshore. So most of our public sector data will go into data havens, often in the US, because Amazon, this is actually the largest area of Amazon's profits. We know that Amazon is a delivering online shopping, but in fact, the largest, more than 65% of their profits comes from their online.
I'm sorry, Kate, to interrupt you. We are not seeing your slides, so please share your screen, but expand your presentation so that we are not seeing your personal files, that we see full screen your slides.
Okay. Wait, let me try again.
Yes.
Share screen.
Mm-hmm. So that we can see the graphics that you worked on so hard.
I'll try again. Is that not showing you?
Let's try. There you go. Wait. Okay, we can see you. Thank you, Kate. Go on.
Right. So yes, I think I was talking about Amazon, right? And so this is an area where, for example, during the pandemic, in some countries, their tracing app for tracing around who you'd been in contact with and who has the virus was outsourced to Amazon and kept in their offshore in Amazon's cloud. And there is no guarantee that governments can have access to that metadata. Now, they would have had a contract to have access to the results of that, but there is a range of ways that Amazon would have that data that can be commercialized at a metadata level. You can also see other examples here of the way that public services have been outsourced to big corporations who profit from particular parts of public service that can be very dangerous to outsource. So, for example, predictive policing tools. Quite a number of countries are now using commercial data companies to predict or to profile potential offenders. In this case, in the Netherlands, it was actually predicting who might commit a crime. It was a profiling tool that sent police to a particular location when the profile of people were identified by this commercial app that was very race-based profiling. There's, I think, increasingly we also see government moving into welfare, big tech moving into welfare and moving out public service employees. This is also part of underfunding and understaffing of public sector, where, for example, welfare decisions are made by an algorithm. Sorry, I'm trying to now move my screen. You might have heard of the Smart Cities initiative across the world, which has been to digitalise those cities. Those cities have been entirely built by corporations, and the result being that municipal services are designed to collect data, but also only designed for the wealthiest who benefit from, who will contribute to the data and whose data can be financialised. Most recently, this is in India, in a particularly famous smart city of Gurugram, that all of the workers there who are living in slums on the outskirts of the so-called smart city have been evicted because during COVID, they're no longer seen as necessary, and their housing burnt down in the so-called smart city. And there is really the governance is all private sector and designed for corporate interests. I think we've mentioned a little bit already about the issues of big tech avoiding tax, but this is another way where our whole public services are undermined because, of course, they're not contributing, but also because they epitomise a broader model of the way that global corporations can avoid tax. And now that they are the largest, of course, they are effectively writing those rules. And though, part of that has been about secrecy jurisdictions for tax evasion, but we now also see data secrecy jurisdictions. This is just an example of how Apple has specifically sought to find both secrecy jurisdictions and jurisdictions that have no democratic opposition, so that they can be reassured of maintaining that position. So Deborah also mentioned this. I think there is a solution, and in the public sector, I think we, as unions, we need to work hard on what it means for what it could mean to reshape this idea of what data is, who owns it, and what is the purpose of collective data, and turn it into the idea of data as a public good. This is the time, I think, to do that, because there is a lot of realigning of what's important in light of COVID and an appreciation for public services and public service workers. But it won't be easy. It won't be easy at all, because, as Deborah said, the rules have been written by big tech. So there's a significant amount of work to do that. We've actually published these 2 papers on this. One of them is specifically on this area. How could we move to the idea of data as a public good? And the other one looks at those trade rules that Deborah was mentioning and focuses in a little bit more on public services. And so lastly, really what we think we need to do now, I think it really needs us to have these kind of conversations and start thinking about the fact that we've shifted entirely the type of economy we have. And that does mean we need to be part of deciding what a social contract is. And that's, I think, from a union perspective, of course, we gained whatever we did gain in the post sort of Second World War era as a social contract was gained through a struggle, not through sort of a gift. And that was through a struggle of workers and communities. And so that needs to be part of our work and building up sort of engagement of those communities and understanding what it means to their work in specific sectors. I think we need to understand what governments are doing, and that's hard, but to sort of see how they're making these decisions, because big tech does know. And if we track how they actually brag quite a bit about how governments didn't have any idea of cloud and the need to move their data onto the cloud in private hands, and none of them thought it would be feasible or possible for the public to accept that all of that data was in public hands, but they have worked with them to rewrite the rules. So I think these are primarily recommendations that echo some of Deborah's, so I might leave it there. And sorry, I'll share the presentation because you obviously missed out on some of my first slides.
Thank you very much, Kate. Really quite comprehensive and quite a lot of information. I think the emphasis on public service and decent work and how that relates to digitalization. And I think we also be very concerned about the privatization of digital data. And I think it speaks to the notion of transparency about these contracts, such as the one that you point out about Amazon in terms of contact tracing. How many countries and how many of us know what the nature of that contract is? And when government makes these secret contracts, they usually have their own undermining, because the companies, as you say, already know, and they have batteries of lawyers that have these contracts. And when these contracts are not discussed in Parliament or in public, then that's how that goes. I think you've raised some really important questions that we need to think about for our discussion. What do we want as feminists in terms, you already flagged something, redistribution of social contract in terms of wealth, power, information, across gender, between gender and across rich and poor. And I think these are very important questions that we need to look at, but we also need to look at the question of access to digitalization and digital information and digital use and access for education, for poor children in many developing countries as Jamaica, where we are told to get internet connection when people don't have internet connection to go to school. So all of these are questions of part of how, if we are able to significantly tax and recharge and make these firms accountable, we can be able to redistribute the data in a framework that's human rights centered, gender friendly, and poverty and pro-poor in many respects. And I look forward to coming back to that. Now we're going to wrap up the presentation. Remember, we do have a respondent with Anita Gurumurthy, who's a founding member and executive director of IT for Change, where she leads research on the issue in the context of the platform and data and AI governance. And Anita is going to really bring it home a lot to talk to us really about what does this really mean at the level of the implementation, at the level of serving women as workers, as caretakers in community, and among the wide spectrum of which women operate, which are critically important for the economy. So Anita?
Thank you. It's a hard ask to come after Deborah and Kate, and but I will focus a little bit on moving the compass forward in terms of trying to understand digital public goods against this backdrop that has been provided, which is a macro analysis of big tech and big tech mediated society. So why do digital public goods matter for a feminist digital society? I will try and grapple with this question. As previous speakers have observed, big tech and its phenomenal power undermines democracy and the rights of citizens and workers. So for feminists, there are two imperatives. The first is to understand the forces we need to challenge. And the second is to claim the space to frame the narrative of the digital. So firstly, on the forces we need to challenge, today imperialism has a new root. Capitalism is not the same. It keeps reinventing itself, and this we know. And we know that neoliberal capitalism is the most flexible form of capitalism, and it is able to have new avatars, in the digital age. In the context of data, the usurpation of the data commons, what Kate laid out is not just about your data and my data and the patterns coming from our preferences, but also digitized data from the Internet of Things that is brought into the data market. Real economy value chains are today getting intermeshed with data value chains. What this means is that the business of agriculture, education, health, and every other thing is now changed. The way we produce, the way we plan production, the way we take it to the market, the way we market, how companies manage their workers, all this is embedded partly and wholly or wholly in the digital. Another way to put it is that economic activity is going platform. From farm-to-table platforms to platform marketplaces for retail e-commerce, digital labor platforms, and platformized delivery of critical public services such as health and education. Without becoming part of these platform ecosystems, it's simply not possible for anybody, women in particular, to fully participate in the digital paradigm. Without being part of Amazon's online ecosystem, how can a woman-run enterprise expand its market linkages? What do you do as a small farmer if a new platform company landed up in your village and said that they are setting up this end-to-end farm-to-table channel, and would you like to be part of it? Would you opt in or would you stay out? What would you lose if you opted in, and what would you lose if you opted out? So at some level, digital platforms have attained the status of essential utility infrastructure today. But the problem is that this essential infrastructure, as has been underlined by Deborah and Kate, is controlled by a handful of powerful companies who call the shots, set the rules, use their gatekeeping and protocol power to determine who will enter, who will exit, and to shape the terms of economic and social interactions en masse, at a macro level, at a global level. This is a huge problem for democracy, for economic democracy in particular. To overturn the state of affairs, we need to recover ideas of digital, ideas of data, and of platforms, and reinstate them within the ambit of accountable governance. We also need to reimagine how digital data and platform infrastructures can be public goods that can promote local economic sovereignty and equitable and inclusive development, and serve as the backbone for social and solidarity economies. This is a whole new thing because the way in which everything is headed now is in the opposite direction. So we need to actually consider different structural interventions. And of course, the previous speakers have laid things out. The first is to prevent platform companies providing essential platform infrastructure from operating in multiple parts of the digital economy. The power of platforms today comes from their dominion over swaths of economic activity through multi-sector vertical markets and data-based horizontal markets. Let me illustrate. Amazon is in retail commerce. It does brick and mortar business in organic foods, and it runs e-pharmacies. So in my city, Bangalore, it started a pilot program after COVID in order to run an e-pharmacy. So this is about vertical markets, and it's present in all these. Similarly, on the data side, Amazon provides platform marketplaces and constantly collects data. So it is in the business of data collection, and it provides analytics services, and it provides cloud storage through AWS. So it has monopoly on horizontal data markets. We may therefore need to look at how competition law, for instance, can force Amazon to choose between Amazon Web Services or the e-commerce marketplace and divest stakes in one of these. Similarly, have Facebook do the social media bit or run digital payments solutions. These are important because the big fish will do all the pinkwashing possible and elbow out small producers and small retailers, a large majority of whom are women. Those who survive will be co-opted into these infrastructures. And so the project is about reclaiming the space so that, we can belong in the economy. The mainstream policy thinking to break up platform monopolies, something that we keep hearing every now and then, especially in the past year and a half, has also been predicated on this idea that there should be interoperability between platforms. There should be data interoperability between platforms. But, even this approach might have some problems because the first movers will be able to take away the data from startups more than the startups being able to attract the users from bigger platforms. So in a network data industrial complex, the first movers often have the advantage that the latecomers really don't. So rather than benefit from the data that they have amassed, smaller businesses might simply end up losing their edge. So competition policy is one route, but in a free market that has gone awfully wrong, we need other kinds of approaches. We've already heard about taxation, labor laws, and also about data flows, the ability to localize data. But there is a strong role for new approaches to digital infrastructure, and that is the public route. So the second structural change we need to think about is to build public options to dominant platforms. Governments need to establish and need to finance models to build public platforms, e-marketplaces, and ensure that women producers and service providers are able to benefit from these infrastructures. The third policy change we need is the establishment of seed funding mechanisms that can help cooperatives and social enterprises supporting women producers to build their own platforms. These cannot become an alternative to Amazon, and in fact, they should not. These platforms can be hyperlocal, but they need to be able to survive, and that's where public support is needed. And this kind of public support can also be in the form of standards and protocols, which are very, very important public goods. So this is the fourth area where public platforms can support women-run enterprises through public digital standards. Example, payment standards that make for secure payment gateways, avoiding transferring of risks of cyber fraud on women producers or sellers who run small platform cooperatives. So you do need to actually provide these standards, payment standards, so that small businesses can benefit from these layers. Another digital public infrastructure that can help women's businesses is the idea of a public cloud. In a tourism-related study that we did, we found that a large travel and tourism platform in India, Make My Trip, would share ratings and rankings with small hotels and small properties it onboarded in this remote Himalayan village, and it would advise the businesses based on these ratings and rankings. Obviously, the platform wanted to benefit, but this was in the initial stages when Make My Trip was onboarding these businesses in this village. Now, if the government were to be able to support small businesses with analytics, with mentorship, with market intelligence, it would be possible for big data to be truly socialized. Public cloud projects in sectors like agriculture can also be enormously useful for public community partnerships. So you can be a women farmers cooperative who uses an app that provides meaningful advisories, connects the co-op to credit and banking services, connects local suppliers with local buyers, etc. And this service is based on a special agriculture public cloud infrastructure meant for analytics of small businesses. These models can decentralize the benefits of a digital economy, but we do need to put these public systems within a strong accountability framework. And I will, before I wrap up in the next minute or two, I'd like to actually talk about the whole business of the creation of public data pools, which really has picked up very much in the post-COVID context. In all social sectors, health, education, governments are investing, and multilateral financing is going into the creation of public data pools in developing countries. And this is nothing other than the digitalization of existing legacy data into machine readable form, so that you can invite private partnerships and you can actually have some kind of a way by which you generate value in the economy. Invariably, all of this has been going to multinational corporations, but the hope is that through some kind of regulatory framework, you would be able to encourage startups in the domestic context. Governments are also creating non-personal data pools about natural resources, infrastructural artifacts, and these, of course, are enormously valuable for businesses, and therefore we have to be very watchful about how these so-called public data resources end up in public-private partnerships. We have this very infamous example of the NHS data in the UK, and NHS has gotten into a partnership with Amazon so that people can have their medical queries answered by Alexa. And Alexa is linked to the back end of the NHS. And the idea is that people who cannot really afford to stand in a queue or, be on a queue over the telephone, to have a human being answer your questions can actually go to this voice-assisted mechanism. But there are many, many important questions. This is about licensing conditionalities, access and use conditionalities, and the huge opacity surrounding the way in which the government of the UK has gotten into a partnership with Amazon. So what we also need is to understand that institutions of modern medicine are heavily biased against women. So if you asked Alexa a question about what to do because I actually have pain, in my chest, it would tell you, okay, if you're a woman, you might just take, a pill and sleep at home. But for a man, the advice would be approach a doctor. You might actually be suffering from the initial symptoms of a heart attack. So you have input data sets which are heavily gender biased, which are getting into AI systems, which are going to have far-reaching consequences for the way in which access to health is going to be determined. We also have to be very cautious about digital IDs, and digital IDs are indeed an important digital public good, and they can enhance the participation of women in the economy, but without a framework for how digital IDs will be managed within the tyranny of states, and need I say more in these times of democracies having been compromised, we really have to be very cautious. And even as we think, and I would like to conclude by saying that even as we think of the public paradigm and rescuing the public data paradigm for women in the data age, we need to be very vigilant about the hegemonic nature of the state and why the stories that data tell often carry an absolutism. So in this new phase of globalization, what kinds of slippery slopes in data determinism societies may descend to is a very, very vital area we have to engage in. And therefore, we need to think very strongly about integrating digital ID in useless programs where we determine whether that woman deserves to get that social claim as a widow pension is actually a wasted effort. We will, in this efficiency paradigm, end up excluding people. And we have seen that time and again happen to the lives of the poorest women. And therefore, the institutional ethics that need to form the basis of a data society have really to see a super strong engagement from feminists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anita. You've raised a number of issues and you've actually summarized many of the ones. I think you started by talking about why does public good matter for society, and what are the feminist imperatives and the forces we need, identifying the forces we need to challenge, and also reclaiming or claiming our narratives around some of these things in terms of the new forms of profitability that's arising with data imposition. You flagged out a number of areas that needs to be really rigorously interrogated and advocacy launched around: competition policy and competition law that protects or break up some of these hegemonic and monopoly, vertically integrated, horizontally integrated, how they collect data, how they analyze data, and how they use these data. You talk about interoperability and the explicit and hidden dangers there, and I think we'd like to push a little bit more of that, and the first movers advantage and how that will impact small and medium-sized enterprises, especially those run by women. You have also flagged again the taxation dimension, the labor rights and labor law issue that Deborah also flagged. And you talked about the localization of data and what are the issues around that. I think the last thing that we flagged was the public good, and you did like 4 dimensions in terms of the options around public good and how important that is to support for government to have standards and protocol, and also to be supporting cooperatives and social enterprise to build their own platform to enable them to be able to do the work that they need to do and to be able to live in the society. You flagged this whole idea of legacy data, which is something I'd like to discuss more, but I think it might be a private discussion with you. But I think 2 of the points that you made that are critical among everything that you've said was about the dangers around digital ID and digitalization in terms of healthcare and the gender bias implicit in that, and the dangers for women's lives and well-being. There's also a dimension you didn't flag, which I'd like to flag here, is also the use of digital ID and the implications of that for racial profiling and law enforcement and people wrongfully identified by these mechanisms that we have around our cities that are not able to actually distinguish different black faces and so forth, and the dangers of that in this context of intensified racism, especially in the US, but also in other parts. Now I want to turn to our audience, and I know that we still have one respondent, but I just wanted to flag and thank the audience for their patience for being here. I noticed that we have a global audience. We have Nairobi, Kenya, Harare, Zimbabwe, India, Mexico. We have a mix of academic and institution. I see UNESCO's chair here. Thank you all very much for participating, and I hope you are putting your good questions in. We have our last panel, so bear with us. And we have Dr. Laura Mann, who, as I said, is assistant professor, Department of International Development, London School of Economics, who has done a number of work and publications looking at data and digital platforms and looking at democracy issue and the issue of transparency, and how do we what is it, left to other people's device, a political economy perspective on the big data revolution and development, 2018. So really looking forward to your intervention, what you bring to the table with all of these wonderful presentations. Yeah, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mariama, for the warm welcome. And I also just want to thank, and I feel very honored to be able to be a discussant and to engage with these three women. So I've kind of grouped my comments into three kind of ways of thinking about the social contract and how digital technologies might shape them. And usually when I talk about digitization and digital technologies, I like to talk about what tech firms are doing rather than what technologies are doing. Because I think, as a lot of the speakers have already commented, there's a strategy here. There's a kind of business model that is driving the way in which these technologies are being used. It's not kind of technologically driven processes, but it's tech firms driving them. So the three ways are, first of all, democracy and public discourse, holding politicians to account, having critical scrutiny over what politicians are doing between elections and voting them out when we have to. The second way is through productive power. So the extent to which the productivity in the economy is within the bodies and the minds of the population and not just in resources or infrastructures that are owned by companies. And thirdly, looking at taxation. And as some of the speakers highlighted, kind of the ways in which taxation allows for risk pooling and the building of solidarity. So solidarity across genders, solidarity across classes, ages, and races. And it's this idea that society and the economy is stronger when we don't just have individual solutions to things. I think when it comes to public discussions of the ways in which technology companies are shaping the social contract, that it is a lot of focus on that first one, on democracy and public discourse, how some social media platforms in particular have distorted democratic debate and public discussions. And they indeed have a lot of power in order to shape the way in which we talk about social challenges and politics. And particularly the ways in which these technology firms frame the issue of feminism itself. So the very clear example, and perhaps a bit cheeky, is the kind of Sheryl Sandberg idea of leaning in, right? Which a lot of feminists critiqued for being very much a case of white middle-class American feminism. And if you contrast this with how some of these platforms shape working-class women's working hours, for example, and here I have an interesting book by Alex Wood called Despotism on Demand. And he talks about how supermarkets in the UK and the US are trying to use some of these technologies to try and create labor on demand and figuring out the optimal amount of labor they need at any one time and then just pulling workers in. And obviously, you know, if you have childcare responsibilities and family responsibilities, that kind of flexibility is not going to be easy for you to organize your life around. So this kind of flexibility that these companies are trying to enable is obviously going to have a huge effect on women and other people who have childcare and home care responsibilities. But the public discussion around feminism is really shaped in a way that is not going to undermine or challenge the kind of business interests of these platforms in the way that they try and engage the public around them. Some of the people talked about the way in which technology companies also shape kind of algorithmic biases. Their models reflect what a normal user might be. And both Kate and Anita talked about this. And in some cases, these things can be kind of self-fulfilling. If we think about, for example, creditworthiness, if your ideal person that you're making loans to is a white middle-class man in a kind of low-risk environment, and you don't give credit to other people because they kind of fall out of this, you're going to be reinforcing sort of inequalities over time. And this points to Deborah's point about how governments need to have access to algorithms and data for oversight to make sure that these kinds of discriminatory practices are not being entrenched. I think there's also an interest of the way tech firms are part of a broader way in which research is becoming increasingly privatized and commercialized. And as these technology firms embed themselves both into market infrastructures and public services, they are the ones that are able to tell us what is going on. And their decision of whether to grant access to data to researchers, and in some cases that's done through a kind of partnership with CEOs, that has a big impact on what we know about what these firms are doing if they're the ones that have the knowledge of what they're doing. And also there's a sense in which what is being measured is being driven purely by kind of commercial interests. So, for example, in my current research, I'm doing research with colleagues Gianluca Isolino and Marian Uma, where we're looking at agriculture and digitization in the US and Kenya. And we can see that there is a lot of interest in digitizing and quantifying environmental impacts, particularly carbon capture, but not looking at how these things are shaping, for example, local markets, local tax bases, race and work, for example, in California, gender impacts. There are lots of things that we could be measuring with the data being produced, but if commercial interests are shaping what we measure and what we choose to be interested in, we're going to have a very distorted vision of sustainability or, ideas of the good life. So then the two other things is productive power, the extent to which the productive locus of the economy is in the bodies and minds of populations. And I think this something is sometimes missed when we think about the origins of the welfare state. We think about democracy, but we don't think about the fact that a lot of the welfare state was introduced in order to increase the productivity of the workforce, to make sure that workers are healthy, well-educated, that women and men have access to childcare so they can be productive in the economy. And as lots of the presentations, and particularly Anita's presentation, talked about the way in which some of these tech firms are trying to kind of decrease the need for skills and the need for knowledge within workers, right? To kind of shift the skill base away from workers and onto platforms. And I think that this is something we're missing when we talk about democracy, is what happens when people are no longer valuable things to managers, right? When you don't really need people to be skilled or healthy, you don't really need women to have access to childcare. How strong our democracy is going to be if workers don't have that productive power? Another aspect that I think got talked about a little bit today, and is also something that my colleagues Sahini Kar and Kate Meager have talked about, which is the sense of a lot of these tech firms rely on invisible labor in order to scale up, and often that labor is women. So, for example, in Sahini's work, she's looking at financialization in India. And when we think of financialization and when we think of digitization, we think of it as this very quantified, impersonal technology that's just being rolled out. But her work and Kate's work also shows how people are rolling these systems out and people are enforcing compliance. And this is often very low-paid work, very precarious work, very risky work, very socially challenging work when it comes to getting back loans from people. And a lot of this labor is not valued and is not seen as something that needs to be compensated adequately. And I think that particularly in the context of COVID, when we talk about essential workers, a lot of these platforms require labor, invisible labor, in order to work. And at the moment, their value isn't being economically valued in a particularly strong way. So then the last thing, which I think a lot of the presenters talked about, is this issue of risk pooling and solidarity, both the inability to tax companies, but also, and this is something I've read in a paper by Iversen and Ream, talking about how when we have better information about people's risks and costs, there's a kind of individualization, a tailoring going on. So in place of a system where everybody pays the same amount or pays more depending on their income, because we don't know exactly what people's health risks are, we risk pool, we're having a situation where companies can say, I know exactly how much you cost in terms of insurance, or I can give you your own education for your children, perfectly tailored, or I can provide you with a safe, risk-free transport service. We're seeing a lot of public infrastructures being undermined by this individualization. And particularly when we think of debates around private healthcare and the fact that just being a woman is a pre-existing condition, how willing will men be to pay extra money for women to have healthcare that they need if they consider that to be something that doesn't affect them personally? And also we can think about the interactions here of gender, class, and race. The way, for example, Uber talks about how it's minimizing risk for women. Well, these are, upper class women that can afford private transportation. What happens to the wider public transport system? And for women who can't afford, to take private transport if public options start disappearing. So many business models within the tech world are built around giving people better, more individual, more tailored, less expensive personal solutions. And this is, typically something that we were unable to do in the past. And risk pooling was a way of kind of financing these services. But if it becomes more and more possible to individually calculate costs and risks, this is definitely going to have a big impact on women and other groups that need more risk pooling typically. The last things I'll say, some critical comments about the presentation, is I think we should always be aware of what is technology, where is technology to blame and technology firms, and also wider forces that they're interacting with. So I think, for example, the way in which there is a singular emphasis on shareholder value, in the way in which we value companies and value activities, this, I think, has driven a lot of the kind of de-skilling in the economy and the restructuring of work. Focus on efficiency, perfect competition instead of sort of the structure of competition and local economic health, the criminalization or the sidelining of states. These other processes are also driving these changes. And I think I'm about to be told that I'm running over. So stop there. Thank you all, and thank you, Mariama.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Very good. I think you really wrapped it up very nicely, and you raised some critical questions. I think the starting point that you raised about distinguishing between technology and the business and strategy model of the tech firms themselves, and how that then you link that to the issue of customization and individualization that might seem very attractive, but actually have implications for public infrastructure, for transportation, and for all of the other things that the other panelists have spoken about. And one of the other issue from our perspective, I think, which is something I hadn't thought about, but I think that's really interesting, you raised the possible or the gatekeeping function that tech firms can have for research in terms of access to data, information, and even maybe drive the questions and that research might think. So these are some new things that came out. I think your distinction about the welfare states and why it arose and what it did versus where we are now. So we had this two dimension of the social contract, right? We had the social contract from 1945 to about 1980, using Gita and Marina's thing. And then we had 1980 to 2008 of the financial crisis. And now we'll have another discussion and debate around another social contract, which will be around the tech firms, business model, and the technology that drives that. So great. I think that those are really good you made a lot of things, and I won't be able to go there much, but it's really a very interesting, and I'm looking forward to reading your work and reading all of the work that the panelists have put forward. And now I'd like to open it up for some questions. I was scrolling the comments, and I didn't see any particular questions, but I don't know if there are Rosa or Emily have been noticing any particular questions that came out. But I open it up for the panel, for the audience to have a few minutes. And then we'll close with Amelia. So does anyone, how do you know when people are raising their hands on this? I'm not used to this platform, so I don't see any particular questions as such. I see lots of comments commenting on the excellent presentation of the panelists, and that's very good. Somebody wants you to write the title of the book you referred to, Laura.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't see how I can put it in, but I shall do this while we wait.
Okay. And Marcella Ballara says that your presentation has been very helpful for her organization, Laura. And I think both Rosa and Amelia will probably put a lot of these resources that we flagged here as part of the website where all of the other previous presentations are. So I think people don't need to be so worried that you won't have it. But thank you, Laura. I think we'll get that all to people that were flagged. Other comments and so? All right. So then I think I'm going to stop there. I've spoken a lot. I think there's a lot of food for thought coming out. We saw the trade dimension, the tax dimension, public good dimension, the gender bias, and some of the racial bias, the hidden and some of the explicit dangers of the tech model, of the strategy and models that are being put in place. And we see also that we're again in the process of restructuring of the labor force, but it's another kind of restructuring that we didn't see since the 1980s and 1990s. And we need to look at what that means in terms of the lives of women and how women are utilizing this. So I'm going to pass this over now. We're at our time. We have about 13 minutes left. So again, does any of the panelists have some last words they'd like to say, given that we have no questions? Any last things that anyone would like to say that you felt like you didn't get a chance to say? And then I'll leave the last 5 minutes for Amelia. Anyone? Yes, Deborah. Your microphone.
Okay, I didn't know I could do it myself. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention, because I really appreciate all of the other presentations, and it's incredible, but for many of you are involved in different, feminist activities or maybe different agencies and are looking at these things from development perspective, you may not realize it is really incredible right now in the WTO that they are really trying to move these very anti-feminist, very anti-development provisions forward. And they not only are framing the whole thing as e-commerce for development, right? So there's actually a pitch that these are all really organized around helping small and medium enterprises in developing countries. If you can imagine, sort of the hubris of big tech disguising themselves as being good for MSMEs in developing countries. But they've actually created now an entire gender a focus within the WTO. And they're actually appropriating the image of the developing country woman online entrepreneur. And so they bring on, sort of a Kenyan woman who's trying to sell flowers online or something, and, say, oh, look, if you do this, or if you're a Bangladeshi home worker and you just want to stay home and do leather work, and then you can get connected with Amazon, and then jing, 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 all this money will somehow come into your eBay account through your PayPal and everything. And it's really appropriating all of the history of the amazing work that feminists have done to highlight the importance of gender in economics and turning it into this vessel to try to push a very neoliberal, very anti-feminist, very anti-development agenda. And so if you are interested in that, there is a gender and trade coalition that is coordinated by our colleagues that are part of the Our World Is Not for Sale network, Thorough Network, and others. And maybe some of the other women who are here can also speak to that. But it's very problematic, and I think we need to hear from more feminist voices within, at the national level with your own governments to say this is ridiculous that our feminist agendas about equality and about social transformation are being co-opted to promote neoliberal economics in favor of big tech corporations based in the US, which are completely sexist and are completely, appropriating and devaluing women's labor. So let's have that be a call to outreach if folks are more interested in getting involved. The Gender and Trade Coalition, Third World Network, lots of other groups are involved in it. We need more support in that actual advocacy with governments, both at the national level and in the WTO. Thank you.
Great. And they've put up Fatima's comments. Anyone else from the speakers want to have a last word? Anita, Laura? Anita, yes?
Thank you very much. Lot of food for thought. And so I take it that the absence of questions is also because I think the perspectives were so bang on and so appropriate in some sense that reflects the crisis we are going through at a macro structural level. I just wanted to respond to two things from Laura, which I found quite important, provocative. I look at the way in which this de-skilling is particularly going to affect a country like India. There are innumerable projects on the future of work, and this is coming from everywhere, and somehow none of this is actually able to touch the lives and livelihoods of the majority of women. The house help who comes to my place, her daughter is going to just lead this very same life of precarity that she did, perhaps even worse, because Indian nutrition data is saying that intergenerational nutrition is really bad. So there is this kind of idea, or the power of this rhetoric, which is the large narrative that tech firms, as you remind us, are trying to advance about how there's a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow. But actually, I think the de-skilling is something that we can actually see in the evisceration of people's abilities to contribute productively in front of our eyes. Mm-hmm. So linking that to the beautiful point you made about risk pooling and a society that is moving towards individuating risk, I also see that a logical extension of that is going to be disenfranchisement by default. And I think we need to understand that this disenfranchisement by default is that to claim a right, you will have to prove in the first place that you're deserving of that right. Mm-hmm. Because your social credit score will tell you that you didn't repay the past loan, or perhaps you lost your digital ID card and you went for a healthcare facility and someone said, no, go back in the queue because you haven't brought your card, or go back home, and you've actually walked 14 kilometers to come to that facility. So there is a certain, I think, other side of this coin about individuation of risk, which actually makes the most vulnerable have to really scream at the top of their voices without being heard at all that they too are citizens. And I think that this erosion of citizenship is a kind of public crisis that this new epoch that Mariama so beautifully described in her understanding of the social contract is quite unprecedented. So the feminist project is quite challenging. I mean, people often say, no, don't talk to us about sad stories. But I think to rise up against these big monstrous challenges is hard.
Sorry. But with organizations and writings and researching such as what's been done by Kate, yourself, Laura, Amelia, Rosa, and all of the people who are on this web who are making these wonderful comments, I think it's not insurmountable. We'll have to do it. And I think we have to undergird this social contract in our gender-sensitive, gender-responsive, gender-interpretive view of human rights, including political, civil, and all of the rights and labor rights. All of those things have to be part of this net with which we struggle with. Kate, did you have? We'll have to do it. And I think we have to undergird this social contract in our gender-sensitive, gender-responsive, gender-interpretive.
I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm hearing me again too, and I don't know why.
Political, civil, and all of the rights and labor rights, all of those things. I'll try and say something with that going in the background, but maybe one of the reasons also we don't have so many questions is that I find myself needing to read some of the material that comes from, our sisters, from Deborah and from IT for Change, quite a few times, because it is so it is asking us to really rethink what we're being told day in, day out about, you know, the value of big tech, that they've delivered us all these emancipatory new technologies. I mean, first of all, most of that came from the public sector. You know, a lot of what we have and the capacity to aggregate data actually is from public institutions. But the alternatives that Anita was talking about, I think we really have to sort of cogitate on it, because it's been presented to us, neoliberalism and the market has been presented to us as the only way. Where you know, when we even talk to public sector unions about data as a public good, it's so somehow, you know, people are perplexed by the idea that, could we do that? Is it possible to do that? I mean, it is possible, because, as you said, this isn't natural. Where we are now isn't. It's constructed, and it's been constructed by the interests of a tiny, tiny minority of ridiculously wealthy people, and they've constructed this as the natural order of, you know, of how technology works, and how particularly the knowledge and collective data works. But I think that, for me, I mean, I really encourage people to read some of the documents that have been shared in the papers, because it is possible to do something different. But first we have to understand it, then we have to advocate for governments, and often they don't understand it too. I mean, if we sit through the trade negotiations, we can see sometimes they're actually a little bit unsure about what they're negotiating. It's only big tech who are setting the rules, and I think the title of Deborah's book tells it. You know, they're setting the rules for themselves, and it's really hard. But I don't find it easy. I'm not, you know, I don't have this sort of background, but I think it's important, really critical, as both feminists and labour activists, to fully understand it and do what we can.
Yeah, I think
so thanks for the organisers to help us.
Thank you, Kate. Someone mentioned something that you flagged. I'm not sure who mentioned it originally, about reimagining the spaces and reimagining the rights and the contracts and how we look at the economy. And I think that's very important. I want to flag for Deborah that Fatima has said that African feminists have now started looking more critically at the African Free Trade Agreement, because a lot of the things that you're talking about people appropriating gender and then misusing it is occurring at the level of the regional trade agreements also. So that's an area of work, and thanks again for flagging the Gender and Trade Coalition. So people are paying very much attention. So I think you have some people linking up with you, Deborah, and others. Laura, last minute.
I just have one question, one comment about this kind of appropriation of women, and then I had a final point to say. So the appropriation, I mean, I've seen this when I was at the University of Leiden. We had this interesting discussion once in a seminar looking at, what's the name of this? There's a Zambian mobile money platform. And we were looking at how the white founder in America was presenting the women entrepreneurs who were his agents as these like very poor women who were strappy entrepreneurs, and they rose themselves out of poverty. And in a way, it's kind of depicting them as these very poor women. And there was a discussion about how these women are actually pretty well off in their communities, well-educated women who might take pride from the fact that they are well-educated and doing pretty well. So it's interesting the way in which the kind of gender operates at different levels, that in the kind of founding community in Silicon Valley, you have to present these women in one way. But when these women are operating in their communities, they have to present themselves as aspirational and strong women. So it's interesting the way that kind of gender gets manipulated at different levels. The last thing I wanted to say, which I've been thinking about lately a lot, is this issue of like the way in which philanthrocapitalists and kind of the privatization of social services, it's not completely neutral in terms of morality and the way in which things around gender and class are framed, that when things are in the public services and controlled by the state, there is supposed to be some kind of democratic accountability and oversight over what the ways in which we conceptualize gender and class and race. But when things move into the private sector and we're relying on charity, there is a lot more potential for, you know, individuals' opinions and beliefs about gender and morality to be imposed on people through these programs. So I think it's another way in which the social contract is being shifted to make it a lot less democratically accountable and controllable by people.
Thank you. And that really links to one of the comments, or the last one before I turn it over to Amelia, which is from Marta Benavides, that says, serious discernment is urgent and new world order is being shaped as we talk. The world of almost 5 billion having what, 2 billion own. And so we need to really rethink and strategize. I think she's trying to point out that as we're talking here, the capital is already constructing its own way of imagining the world. And now I think we've completed the panel presentation and the respondent. Thank you, Laura, really excellent. Thank you very much, Anita. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Deborah, really great. And I'm going to turn the last few minutes of this over to Amelia to wrap this nine series marathon webinar on feminist macro policy and solutions. So, Amelia.
No, thank you so much. Thank you all for our amazing panelists. This was a great conversation and actually very intense in terms of all of the points of entry you pointed out to our advocacy and how we really need to build more alliances across different movements and expertises. And Mariama, you were fantastic. I can see you definitely running your own podcast and webcasts and all of that, because you were fantastic dominating the room. I just really wanted to thank IT for Change and Anita Gurumurthy for partnering with the Women's Working Group on FFD in organizing this webinar, which was fantastic and is inspiring us all and also challenging us to really step up to deliver on all of the challenges that are the panelists and our respondent pointed out. So this is really the final webinar. So I also want to thank the audience who were with us all along, our previous speakers, and everyone who is really working very hard to transforming this world in a meaningful way. From our end, what we can say is that there is actually a strategy coming forward. We want to really start it with all of the reflections and going to our next stage, which is strategizing. So we will have a closing series dialogue on Wednesday, October 21st at 9 a.m. on EST time. And we very much look forward to hearing your inputs as well on how we can envision to do that. We will get in touch with our panelists as well of previous webinars. And we think that the best way in which we can also engage is promoting this initiative by the FFDEC civil society group, as well as the Women's Working Group on FFD, in shaping a campaign of campaigns. There are major macroeconomic demands, but really macro demands that are linked to environmental challenges as well as socials, that compels us all to work together, to learn from each other, to follow the leadership and the expertise of all of these fabulous activists all around the world. So our final conversation is going to try to shape that engagement and lead us in the months to come to face these very hard challenges that humanity is facing. So we look forward to engaging with all of you in that session and luckily in the steps to come. So thank you all. And I know we are very well out of time. So there is nothing from our end as the Women's Working Group on FFD. And I know my partner Rosa from the Feminist Task Force is joining Equidad de Género in saying goodbye for the time. And we look forward to seeing you soon. So, ciao.